Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the COVID-19 Committee. We have received apologies this morning from the convener, Donald Cameron. This morning the committee will be taking evidence on the COVID-19 vaccination programme from Mr Steve Haw, Director of Quality, Regulatory Science and Safety at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, Professor Wei Shen Lim, Chair of COVID-19 Immunisation, Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, Professor Andrew Pollard, Professor of Paediatric Infection and Immunity from the University of Oxford, and Dr Christian Schneider, Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. I'd like to welcome all of you to the meeting this morning. We have quite a large panel of witnesses this morning. We will move straight to questions. Committee members will have 10 minutes each to ask questions of witnesses. So I'd ask that we all keep our questions and answers as concise as possible. If there is time for supplementary questions, I will indicate this once all members have had a chance to ask their questions. And I'll now turn to questions. If I may begin by asking the first question. Everyone wants to be a priority to get a COVID vaccine. We've been having a lot of discussion in Parliament about the policy around schools remaining opening, and the question about whether teachers should be in the first phase of the vaccine rollout. So can I ask our members, first of all, if they believe there's clinical justification for teachers to be included, and how practical that would be, given that it's easier to find teachers all in the one place during the working week. And related to that, at the moment we know that children under 16 are excluded from the vaccine. Is it possible to get any update on the role of children in future clinical trials and the prospects of children getting vaccines, especially those who have health conditions? Thank you. Wonder who would like to go first? Maybe start with Professor Lim.
Morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'll try and answer the question about prioritization of teachers. The current advice from JCVI, which is the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, is that for this initial wave or phase of the program, we should prioritize protecting people who are at risk of dying from COVID-19 and protecting the NHS, which in turn obviously saves lives as well. So this first phase of the program is really trying to capture the vast majority of people who are at risk of the serious and severe outcomes from COVID-19. And that includes all people aged 50 years and above, including people who are younger than that, but have underlying health conditions, down to the age of 16 and above, which is where the licensing, or rather the authority to use the vaccine is available. That's where we stand at the moment. Teachers who are themselves at risk from severe disease will obviously be captured within that phase 1 program. The other question, I think, which arises then are teachers who may be younger than 50 years of age, who are in schools, but who are not themselves at very high risk of severe disease from COVID-19. And such teachers, including other key workers across a whole range of occupations, will be considered for vaccination or offer of vaccination in the next phase of the program. In regards to children being included in vaccine clinical trials, perhaps it's better if somebody else answers that question rather than myself.
Thank you, Professor Lim. I wonder, Professor, Dr. Schneider, you have your hand up. We'll come to you next.
Thank you. Just to add on this, indeed, it is not unusual that no children are included in clinical trials for new medicines, including vaccines, unless it is a vaccine intended to be used in children, obviously. So the license bans age from 16 and above, as was already outlined, based on the data on efficacy and safety that we have.
Thank you. Professor Pollard, can you add to that, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm leading the clinical trials of the Oxford vaccine, and we have always planned trials in children because, as you know, there are some subgroups of children who are at a slightly higher risk than others, and there's a lot of interest, I think, particularly from families at the moment of that, but also there could be a point in the future where when the higher risk groups have been vaccinated, as Wei Shen said, that it becomes appropriate to think about some of these other low risk groups. And so our trials do include a plan to start evaluating the vaccine in children. In fact, that's hopefully will start very early in the new year. And I know from colleagues working with the other vaccines, so for example, the Pfizer vaccine and with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that they are planning trials in children all to start extremely soon for exactly these reasons. But I fully support the policy decisions that Wei Shen is talking about, to start off with the people who are at highest risk of disease, such as healthcare workers, and those at higher risk of severe disease, particularly the elderly and adults with other health conditions.
Thank you very much. Well, that's encouraging to hear. I know that in my area where we recently were in the highest level, and children who'd previously been shielding had been advised to stay at home and be homeschooled or do remote learning. I'm thinking of young people with cystic fibrosis, conditions like that, and there's a real feeling of exclusion. Steve, did you want to add anything? You've appeared on my screen. No? Okay. I'll move on into the next question that I had. I have been reading that women who are I wonder if our panel could say a bit more on that, and in particular on the breastfeeding issue. I think that there's a concern that we could see breastfeeding rates drop. So again, is there something happening in terms of future clinical trials that addresses concerns around uptake for women who are planning a pregnancy, are pregnant, or are breastfeeding? I think that would be helpful to hear. And I think Professor Pollard wants to go first on that.
The reason why those groups are initially excluded from the clinical trials is obviously things have moved very fast this year, and I think quite appropriately regulators really want to establish safety and efficacy in healthier younger adults first of all, before starting to target pregnant women and the additional concerns there might be until we've got established safety data. But now we've reached that point with multiple vaccines, and there are indeed plans to start evaluations of vaccination in women who are pregnant. And I think this is particularly important, not just here, but in many countries around the world where an important target group will be healthcare workers, where we have a lot of women of childbearing age. So that is an absolute priority in 2021 to address that group. But there's a second question which is sort of related to this, is what about women who become pregnant after they've been vaccinated? And that's actually a group where we will have quite a lot of data. And although pregnancy is usually avoided, or at least the participants are asked to avoid in clinical trials, inevitably, in large trials, as is happening with all of these vaccines, there are many women who have become pregnant following vaccination. And of course, we already have a small amount of follow-up data for those women across all of the different developers. But what we really need to know and to be able to assess is the outcomes of those pregnancies. And obviously you need time for that. We follow up the babies after they've been born and so on. So this isn't something which you get a very quick answer to when you're following pregnancy, but it absolutely is a focus of the work that is going on. As far as breastfeeding is concerned, I don't think with any of the vaccines that are being considered here in the UK, there is any scientific reason to be concerned about breastfeeding, because there isn't something which is likely to be transmitted from the vaccine if a woman was vaccinated that would get to the infant or be harmful if it did. But again, those studies have not actively been pursued so far, but there is certainly consideration going on of that at the moment. I don't know whether Wei Shen wants to comment on that from a policy perspective.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I completely agree with everything you've said, and particularly around the absence of any information in women who are breastfeeding that suggests any harm. So there may be ways of interpreting the absence of information and what stance one takes, whether one is more permissive or less permissive based on that. And we're trying to take an appropriate and, if you will, reasonably cautioned approach in terms of allowing people who are breastfeeding to receive the vaccine and be assured that, as far as we can tell, there is no concern that has been found so far. I wonder if the MHRA obviously are the group that authorized the use of the vaccines in different patient groups or people groups, and it may be appropriate to ask MHRA about their views about safety in breastfeeding.
Thank you. I've just also had a message. I don't think everyone could hear the question. There might have been a bit of an issue with connectivity. So the question was around women who are pregnant or planning a pregnancy or are breastfeeding, so just really around their inclusion in the vaccine at this point and any future clinical trials, so just the wider safety of that. So Steve Haw, did you want to comment on that yet?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so Professor Pollard was quite correct that some women have become pregnant during the course of the clinical trials, and the sponsors of those clinical trials have agreed that they will follow up for at least 2 years after the first injection. So we should get some data. There is insufficient data at the moment to give the MHRA that confidence, and I'm sure Dr. Schneider would probably approve that. But in terms of the wider question about will they include pregnant women in other future clinical trials, and this goes beyond the vaccine. So as the trade body, the ABPI has actually convened a group of clinicians, academics and industry to address that very question about how we can include pregnant women more in clinical trials, regardless of its vaccine, medicine or therapy. And there may be some myths, I think, that we might need to break down. That's kind of the purpose of that group, certainly in next year, is to actually address those myths and actually work out how we can actually include and encourage pregnant women to come forward to clinical trials and give those clinical trial investigators the confidence that they can do that.
Thank you. That issue of confidence is very important. Dr. Schneider, I'll come to you just to wrap up on this line of questioning.
Thank you. Indeed, I can confirm what was said. So basically, there is no strict contraindication in this. It's more of a statement that there is no or limited data for the time being, both for pregnancy and also for breastfeeding. And this is why, as a precautionary principle, it is not recommended. But obviously, and I'm sure that there might be more individual recommendations also be possible for patients. who are at a high risk individually and so on. But of course, you cannot cover these scenarios in a regulatory information sheet as we have published. So the advice stands as it is, but this is not because of a particular concern. It is because of the absence of data for the time being.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I'll move on to our next question, and that's from Mark Riscoe.
Thanks very much, Monica, and good morning to the panel. Can I ask about the question of uptake within different groups in society? There's already been some concerns that the Black and minority ethnic community, the level of uptake potentially may be lower in that community, and I'm interested to know, how are we monitoring particularly vulnerable groups like the BME community, who already face massive health inequalities, and other groups as well, such as older people. And I think a lot of this obviously comes down to confidence in the vaccine, but there may be other factors as well. So I'm interested to know how you are these issues and how you monitor and then adjust the strategy going forward on vaccination to take account of these factors.
Oh, I think Professor Lim is on mute, but I think wants to go first, so just try to direct our broadcasting. So Professor Lim, and then I think Professor Pollard.
Yes, thank you. So I'll start, and then Andy can come in as well. Clearly, uptake is extremely important. Just offering a vaccine on its own is only the first step in the program. The offer needs to be understood, it needs to be accepted, it needs to be received, and the vaccine then needs to be received as well. And it's until the vaccine is received that's the end of the process, and then protection hopefully starts from there. So it's indeed extremely important that we have a view and monitor the whole process up to the point of uptake in different groups. And the groups that one is perhaps most worried about include not just people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, but also other groups who maybe have difficulty in accessing healthcare or engaging in healthcare for various reasons. And these could include homeless people, for example. And then there are groups who live in the poorest, most deprived neighborhoods in our society. And again, we know they have greater difficulty perhaps in uptaking vaccines usually. So there are a whole range of people in whom very clear monitoring and help needs to be done right now to engage with these communities. So JCVI's advice really is in two halves, I would say. The first half is the offer of the vaccine according to priority groups, but the second half, which is equally important and shouldn't be overlooked, is the implementation of the advice. And that implementation, we are stressed, needs to be locally tailored and locally appropriate, which involves engagement with community leaders and community people, opinion leaders who can influence and promote vaccine uptake in the correct populations locally. So that's extremely important, and thank you for raising that. Maybe I'll hand over to Andy at this point.
Well, thanks, Rachel. I mean, I can only really speak from the trial perspective, and I think an absolute priority for us, and I know for other developers, has been to make sure that testing of vaccines is done across different ethnic and cultural groups. It is definitely challenging to do that because it very much depends on the makeup of the population around trial sites that you're working in, and also the willingness of different groups to participate in clinical trials. And I think it's true to say that for most developers, to get good representation from those groups has been much more difficult than we might have anticipated, despite active efforts to engage with those communities. But we do have representation in the UK trials. One of the other things that we have done is to conduct trials in other countries with much more diverse populations. So in Brazil and in South Africa, but that across our suite of trials, we have very good representation of people from very different backgrounds. And I know in the trials that are underway in the US, that there is the same approach is being taken to try and make sure there's good diversity in the population, including extending the trials for longer to give more time specifically to enroll in the BAME communities who didn't participate as much in the first part of the enrolment in the trials. I think these are really important different strategies that developers are using to try and make sure that we do have good representation for the smaller populations that sometimes are harder to access in clinical research.
Okay, thanks for that. I suppose another really key question here is about when will we know if the vaccines are effective in terms of preventing transmission of the virus, and when do you think that will be? When can we get clarity on that? I'm not sure who to direct that question to, Monica, but.
Okay, Steve Hall has his hands up, I think, from the previous question. So we'll come to Steve first, but if other witnesses wish to respond, waving your hand is a good way to let me know. Steve.
Thank you very much, Deputy Convener. So I'll answer both those questions from the industry perspective, if I may. With regards to the confidence, the industry's duty here is to listen to those concerns and to provide the data and assurances that are required. And the industry, the ABPI, have already launched a Value in Vaccines campaign on social media to actually give some of those statistics and provide the context. In the answer to the question around transmittability, that's dependent on some of the criteria within the clinical trials, but I also sit on the Test and Trace Task Force, and at the last meeting, there was an NHS representative who pointed out that there is an ongoing study to look at post-vaccination and transmissibility, and there's at least 40,000 in that study. So that data is being collected as we speak, and we certainly are very keen to find out the vaccine's impact on transmission rates and viral loading for those who are infected. So it's a wait and see, but I think it is ongoing.
Okay, I don't know if the rest of the panel would want to come in on that. If not, I've got a final question.
Okay, briefly, Mark, although Professor Pollard has raised his hand.
Just to add to that, clearly there are some data that will come from the trials about transmissibility and whether vaccines can interrupt that. All of the vaccines have reduced the number of cases of we have data on, so the number of cases that are PCR positive in our trials. And so there will be an impact on transmission. If there's fewer people who are PCR positive in the population, there will be less disease. But there's a critical point here, which is about herd immunity. And herd immunity is the level at which you've reduced the amount of transmission, or the number of people protected, that the virus can no longer transmit. And that's a much bigger ask than being able to show some impact on transmission of the virus. I would expect once we've got a decent number of people vaccinated in the population, we will see less transmission, and that's going to be really important to be getting back more to normal. But I am concerned that we don't focus entirely on herd immunity at the moment, because it may mean that we need 80–90% of people vaccinated in order to even get close to that, and that's still quite a long way off. And it's likely that we will continue to have some people who are vulnerable in the population who have not been vaccinated or can't be vaccinated. And we're still in a global community where there will be other countries where there's lower rates of vaccination, and this virus is extremely good at transmitting. So herd immunity would be a fantastic goal to reach, but I think that is a long way off. We should focus on protecting the vulnerable and having as many people vaccinated as possible in the population for the direct protection, knowing that we will get some impacts on transmission as well, but we won't stop the virus completely in the first few months of next year.
Okay, thanks. Mark, I think we'll come back.
Thanks, Mark. We'll have to move on to the next question, and that's from John Mason.
Thanks very much. I didn't realise it was me next, Monica, but I'm happy to go. This question of how many doses there are, I see in the, I think it's Mr. Hawes' paper, that it says the UK has 357 million doses. I don't think we've got that many people, and even if you divide by 2, I don't think we've got that many people. So why so many doses, and does that mean that Africa and India are losing out? I think Mr. Hawes muted, is he?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a very good question. So they're not all there ready to land on our doorstep tomorrow. This is a portfolio of procurements that the UK government has carried out, and they will arrive as batches are scaled up and distributed and delivered. So what we're seeing is the first batch of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. As others come through and get approval, then you'll see others coming online. And this is really about spreading your bets on various horses in the race, as it were. So if other vaccines come along and they have a particular benefit to a particular part of the population, then of course they'll probably be distributed accordingly. As you say, there's a large number, but they're not all going to arrive at the same time. And if it looks like there's a few of those horses that we've put those bets on are working, then there is, I believe, in some of the contracts, the right to maybe defer or to actually divert. And as you know, the UK government have already committed some money towards the global COVAX facility. And it wouldn't be surprised then if we do reach what we need ahead of time, then some of those vaccines could actually be diverted to the global solutions.
So can I ask, would these be legally binding contracts for the 357 million?
I don't have that level of detail, but I understand there is some clauses available that can actually divert if necessary.
Fair enough, thanks very much. And then a question for Professor Lim. In your paper, you talk about, and you've already kind of spoken to Mark Ruskell about specific groups. And one of the ones you mention is inequalities that should be identified and addressed in implementation. I was just wondering, could you explain how that would happen? Because you are suggesting we go through an age group. So what are you suggesting about these other inequalities? Who would address them? How would they be addressed?
Thank you. So the implementation really needs to be taken on by local teams working within health authorities, public health, and local community workers as well. So when we talk about the implementation and local engagement, it's really within each of the priority groups, not something that is prioritized separately. For instance, we want good vaccine uptake in all people who are age over 80 years old. And if we know that there are certain groups in that over 80-year-old priority group who are less likely to receive information in the usual way or are more mistrusting of the usual information the way it's given, then those groups need more attention by local teams who understand these communities and are able to engage with them in a way that is meaningful and is constructive to enable those communities to have a high vaccine uptake. So the prioritization and the implementation are not two separate things. They go hand in hand. I don't know whether that helps.
Yes, no, that is very helpful. Thanks very much. And my final question, and then I'm not sure who I'm aiming this one at, so maybe anyone can come in on this one, but just the whole time scale for trying to get the whole population of either Scotland or the UK vaccinated. Have we any idea at the moment what kind of time scale we're talking about? I suppose if nobody's offering to answer that, I'll take that as meaning we don't have any idea. But I mean, would it be a year? To say a year, would that be reasonable?
We have a volunteer.
Yes, I'll volunteer an answer rather than silence. So obviously, timescales are very difficult, and they are dependent on vaccine supply and the ability to deploy a vaccine, and also, of course, on how many vaccines we have available. The more vaccines that pass through the regulatory approvals, the better, because the more flexible the vaccine delivery can be. Particularly, you'll know the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has very stringent cold chain requirements, whereas the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, which we hope will gain regulatory approval, has much less stringent requirements. So the more vaccines we have in terms of different types of vaccines will enable faster deployment of the vaccine. But to put an exact timescale now, I think, might be a hostage to fortune. So I suspect nobody is willing to say by a certain date we will have achieved X percentage.
Okay, thanks very much. I think Dr. Schneider's going to give me a date.
I'm afraid I can't give you a date, but just to build on this, that this is not easy to answer. And the reason for this is that this is a very complex picture, you could say. It depends on the authorization based on adequate data. So the vaccines that we've been talking about, where there's contractual agreements, obviously not all of them have been at the same stage of development. We don't know if they are going to succeed or not. Then obviously companies will have international contractual agreements as well. We are always assuming that manufacturing process can be upscaled successfully, and that there is no problems with manufacturing and so on. And so therefore it is difficult. And you also mentioned before, and other speakers, about the uptake, the willingness of uptake. So there's a lot of factors playing into this. And this is why, in my personal opinion, it's difficult to come with an exact date.
Okay, I expected that. I think Professor Pollard finally.
I was just going to make the very, very brief comment that there's been huge efforts within the NHS to be prepared for vaccination. And so, I mean, my sense is that as we have supply, the planning is extremely advanced to make sure that those doses can be put into people's arms. But I think, as has been said, you first of all have to have regulatory approvals, and we only have one approved vaccine at this stage, and so we have to wait for that. And there is this manufacturing point that Christian mentioned, which is that there's huge efforts going on to make tens of millions of doses of vaccine in the first quarter of next year. And you just have to have one batch to fail, and then you've got a big shortage for a period of time. And it's not uncommon in trying to make huge numbers of doses that some of those batches go to an IPSC and it doesn't pass the very stringent standards which quite rightly are in place. So we can't predict the future completely. But I have a sense that there's huge efforts going to make sure that the NHS is ready to deliver, and the supply chain work that's going on from the manufacturing people, and I'm not one of them, but is also in very good shape at the moment.
Okay, I think very finally, Steve Haw, if you could be quite brief, please. Thanks.
No, certainly. I think I kind of echo that the industry is playing its part. We are working as fast as we can, but we will go as slow as the science and the regulators require.
Thanks, convener.
Thank you. Our next question is from Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. I wanted firstly to ask, and I'm not sure who's best to answer, but how long does a vaccine remain viable for when it's reached a local authority or health board area? And this is an issue of particular interest in remote and island areas, given transport issues, especially around the Pfizer vaccine.
come to Steve Haw first of all.
Oh, hi there. So yes, you're right. And as the vaccine has been developed, we're getting more and more stability data to help us give an understanding of how that vaccine remains viable in storage and in use. And yes, you're right that certainly the Pfizer vaccine has storage conditions which are not ideal. However, Pfizer has put in place these thermal shippers in order to enable that vaccine to stay in those storage conditions for as long as possible, and can be used and can be extended if need be, if there are no -70 freezers around. So the industry has committed to support wherever possible on this, and I believe that the supply chain is in place to reach those hard to reach communities and deliver those vaccines.
You're not able to give a time scale then of how long that would be, the storage capability?
Yes, I think if you bear with me a second, I've got some of the detail here. So regarding the thermal shippers, they can maintain the temperature for 10 days unopened, which allows the transportation, and once opened, a vaccination centre may use the shippers as temporary storage to maintain the recommended storage conditions for up to 30 days with re-icing every 5 days, and once stored, the vaccine vial can be stored for up to 5 days in refrigerated conditions. So I think that's quite an extensive bit of support there.
I wanted to ask about potential wastage during the rollout of a vaccine, and in terms of the Pfizer vaccine, I understand that consignments are made up of 975 doses, and within that, vials are in packs of 5. So, say for example, 37 people are to be vaccinated, that would require enough packs that would consist of 40 doses, and that would mean 3 spare vials potentially could be wasted. And given that there's a tier system of vaccine delivery, should some flexibility be built into that to allow a more pragmatic approach to be taken to fully utilise the spare 3 vials for another group? Should we not be trying to vaccinate as many people as we possibly can?
So we'll have an indication from Dr. Schneider and then come back to Steve Haw.
Thank you. This is indeed a very important and valid question. The problem is that, speaking for the Pfizer vaccine now, this is a very fragile construct. So messenger RNA within lipid nanoparticles is very fragile. This is why it has to be frozen at -70 degrees. So the instructions that we have given at the authorization is based on data that support that within these conditions that we have given, the vaccine will be stable. So once it's reconstituted, it is very fragile. The problem is that pragmatism, as much as it is desirable, would maybe lead to a situation where it cannot anymore be guaranteed that the vaccine is efficacious at all, or that it is safe to use. And this is inherent in the nature of the product rather than the regulations that we have in place. This is based on the science of the product, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Steve Haw?
I was going to direct you to Dr. Schneider actually on that one. I think the MHRA have considered splitting those packs in order to do that. That's my comment.
I think both Professor Lim and Professor Pollard have their hands up too, so Beatrice, you're content for more answers? Yep.
Happy to.
Professor.
Thank you. So wastage is certainly something that we don't want to see, especially for these precious vaccines. And the priority groupings at the moment, for example, allow some latitude. We have advised that there should be, if you will, common sense and flexibility operationally in the use of vaccines. We've not said that the priority groups are rigid and one has to vaccinate everybody in one group, because as we know, it's the offer of vaccination, and it might be that some groups don't want to take up the offer, in which case one has to move through the groups. At a local level, I want to reassure that at the moment, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is being processed, if you will, or deployed through mass vaccination sites precisely to avoid high levels of wastage. And just an example from my own trust, we've tried very hard to invite people who are over 80 years of age to come for vaccination. And at the very end of the day, if there are any vaccines that are left and available, then healthcare workers who are in the immediate vicinity are invited in to come and have the vaccines. And obviously, because they are already in the mass vaccination site, which is a healthcare trust, they can turn up for vaccination within 10 minutes or 15 minutes to make sure that no doses are wasted in that way.
That makes sense. Professor Pollard?
Yes, thank you. I was just going to make the point about one of the really critical parts of our vaccine development has been our mission to have the vaccine not for profit and available in all corners of the world. And so an important part of that has been developing it that it can run through the normal vaccine cold chain using fridge temperatures, so that it could go to remote villages in Africa as well as islands in Scotland. And so I think this is a really important part of what we've been thinking about in terms of the distribution. But there is a separate issue here, which is around wastage, which you brought up. And one of the ways to approach mass vaccination, particularly at this time when there's been a shortage of pharmaceutical grade glass to actually fill vials of vaccine, is that the manufacturing involves 10-dose vials. And so this really comes back to the point that Wei Shen was making, that if you have a 10-dose vial but only 5 people turn up, once that vial has been opened for more than 6 hours, you have to throw it away. And so it does require very careful logistics on the ground to make sure that once the vial is open, that you do have a system in place to make sure that those doses aren't wasted. And that can be particularly problematic in more remote areas where you tend to have higher wastage, because it's harder to have a pool of people who can come to that sort of drop in at the end of the day to use the remaining doses.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And just finally, can I ask, and it follows on from John Mason's questions, how many people would need to be vaccinated before it's safe to reduce any restrictions? Or can't you give an indication? Nobody wants to answer that one. Oh, fair enough.
Lim.
Oh,
Professor Lim.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll have a go again to answer the question. It's generally estimated that if a vaccine was highly effective at blocking transmission, maybe 70, 80 or 90% at blocking transmission, then given the transmissibility of this coronavirus, one might need to vaccinate up to 70 or 80% of the population. That's one estimate that's been given. So this is the herd immunity that Andy Pollard was just describing earlier on. So it's very high levels of vaccine uptake that will be required to completely stop transmission of the virus through the population.
thank you. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Beatrice. Professor Pollard, can I pick up on something that you said? You mentioned a shortage of pharmaceutical grade glass. I haven't been aware of this issue. Are you able to just expand on that and tell us how serious that issue is and what's being done to address it, please?
Well, I think it's been I think it's been a problem throughout this year globally, because there's a lot of vaccines being developed, and more than have ever been made in 1 year before. And so both the glass that's required to make the vials and the filling capacity around the world is being fully used up. And so there's been huge efforts this year to make sure that supply chains for different countries and different vaccines are properly established. And I think we're in good shape. But one of the ways in which that's been addressed has been by the use of multi-dose vials, because if you put 10 doses in a vial, you need less glass, and you don't have to have so many hours of filling capacity. Whereas if you need 10 times as many vials to fill, then it takes 10 times longer. So I think that the systems have been put in place. There's been the whole year to do that. But one of the ways in which industry has adapted to this is by trying to work out what's the most efficient process that could be put in place in order to do that.
Thank you, that was very helpful. Okay, our next question is from Stuart McMillan.
Convener. Just a question, first of all, to any of the panellists. Are they aware of any testing that took place or is scheduled to take place with people who are addicted to drugs? No.
Oh, who would like to?
Professor Pollard.
I think it's difficult to answer the question in a very specific way about testing in individuals as a population who are addicted to drugs. But what I can say is that within the trials, which are open to everyone, there are people who take drugs and have addictions who are included in those clinical trials. But that's a slightly different answer. I mean, they are included in the trials, but there isn't a specific analysis of a large number of people who are addicted to drugs, for example, that I can point to.
Okay, no, that's helpful, thank you. A question to Professor Lim. In your written submission, you, and I quote, you've got a sentence that says, care home workers are therefore considered a very high priority for vaccination. Now, I'm aware that in my constituency this week, I've been contacted by multiple individuals who work in care homes who have indicated that they will not be taking the vaccine. Now, I'm concerned about this because of the protection for the residents of the care homes, as well as also the individuals who actually work in the care homes themselves and the wider community. Is there anything that could be done or should be done to encourage all care home workers to take the vaccination? That's Professor Lim.
Thank you. Yes, I agree that every effort should be made to encourage care home workers to take up the offer of the vaccine, because it's important both as individuals who are exposed potentially to the virus more frequently and exposed to vulnerable people. So if there is even a small chance that the vaccine will block transmission, then it will be helpful in protecting other people as well. So there's a personal benefit and there's a healthcare or social care benefit overall. It comes back really to this suggestion and advice that local leaders need to understand why care home workers might be reluctant to take up the vaccine, and the reasons for that may differ in Scotland compared to somewhere in England, for instance, and understanding those issues will be helpful in encouraging uptake.
I mean, obviously it's very early in the process for the current vaccination programme, and so the attitudes may change as more people do get the vaccine, and that's reported more within the local community as well. So that might change, but certainly I generally was concerned when I was approached by care home workers, because as you quite rightly identify, many of the people who stay in care homes are some of the most vulnerable in our communities.
Yes,
a question.
It may be worth noting that the flu vaccination, annual flu vaccination offer It's also extended to care home workers this year, and there are differential uptake rates between hospital and primary care healthcare workers against care home workers. So it's not a specific, if you will, reluctance, I don't think, related to the COVID vaccine itself, or that's what it would appear to be. It may be more a general concept of having a vaccine in order to protect oneself and the people that people are caring for. So there may be some work that needs to be done that will improve uptake not just for COVID vaccines, but also other vaccines that are equally important throughout the year.
No, thank you. A question for Dr. Schneider. Did Brexit have any influence on the ability of the MHRA to grant the temporary authorisation so quickly?
Thanks. There was a small crack on the line, so I just repeat the question to check if I understood it correctly. So it is the impact of leaving the EU on our temporary authorization for the Pfizer vaccine.
Yes, did Brexit have any influence on the ability of the MHRA to grant the temporary authorization quickly?
Thank you. So the temporary authorization is the realization of a European law into UK law. So this basically enables us to do this now, as it would enable any other country to do this, and that will continue. So emergency situations like this can occur also in the future. So this is enshrined into the British legislation, so that will not change. Obviously, if this year the European Medicines Agency was to authorize one of the vaccines, then that would be directly applicable in the UK. If that was beyond 1st of January, then the MHRA has its own powers in law to issue a marketing authorization.
Are there any concerns around the potential impact of Brexit on the vaccine supply chain? You did touch upon the vials a few moments ago, but on other aspects?
So from an authorization perspective, I would not have any concerns, because we do have the legislative and the authoritative power now to issue a temporary authorization, and we will have own powers from 1st of January to do this. We do have the resource in-house to do the assessment. Obviously, there is questions then on supply coming into the country, which I can't comment on, but where we can or where we are part of this, then we have ensured that everything is in place, so that there are no problems from the regulatory perspective.
No, thank you very much. And I've got one final question, Convener, as to any of the panellists. When and how will we know if the vaccine actually affords longer-term immunity? That's for any of the panelists. Professor Pollard.
Professor Pollard.
Thank you. I mean, we're obviously monitoring immunity all the time, and in our trials, we've just reached the 6-month time point, and we're analysing those blood samples at the moment to see how long immunity lasts. We do have, with the type of vaccine, we're making some experience in the past where we've seen the immune response last for well over a year after vaccination. But I think we have to take the scientific approach, which is to actually do the measurements and have a look. But of course, you can't tell how long it lasts until time has gone by. And because of the nature of the pandemic, time hasn't yet gone by long enough to answer the really important question about whether we're still going to see strong immune responses next winter, which I think is going to be a really critical point for all of the vaccines and for protection of populations at that time. So that really does need following up over time. But there's a separate question, which is whether the immune responses that we see correlate with protection. And we don't know that yet. There is work to do, and that's started across all the developers, to see whether these antibody levels, for example, that we're seeing in blood samples, tell you that that person is protected. And that is work that we can do early in the new year to try to establish whether what we're seeing in the blood is a predictor of protection. If it is, then we may well be able to say next winter whether we think the population is still protected.
At the moment, are you anticipating the vaccine to be an annual vaccine, similar to what we have to do for the flu vaccine? Or is it too early to say?
We don't know yet. I mean, the flu vaccine is an annual vaccine for a very particular reason, and that's because the flu viruses change every year. And so we need to redesign the vaccine each year to cope with the predicted strains which will circulate. But we don't yet know with this coronavirus whether its mutations, we've heard some of those in the news over the last few weeks, whether any of those are going to affect the performance of vaccines. At this stage, there's no evidence to be concerned about with that, but it is something which we absolutely have to continue to monitor going forwards.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, our next question is from Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. This is a question for Mr. Steve Hoare. What are the implications, Mr. Hoare, if the national regulators reach differing conclusions on vaccines seeking approval? Would you like to come back on that?
So the national regulators, as in difference of opinion between the MHRA and regulators for other countries?
Yeah, correct.
Then the industry will take the advice of those regulators in those countries and act accordingly.
Right. Okay. Would Dr. Snyder like to comment on that?
Thanks. I was muted. So thanks, indeed. This is an important question. So the MHRA is working with other regulators across the globe. So we do have informal information exchange. And if that situation would happen, that one regulator comes to a different conclusion than the other, obviously, we will have to look at the details of that different conclusion, in as much as it is applicable to the MHRA and to the UK. So it really depends on the case. The likelihood that this could happen is not high, but of course there is a possibility that this may happen. And this will have many factors playing into this, but they are internationally recognized standards, and we have seen clinical trial programs as they are. So I would be surprised if that was to happen. But as I said, we are internationally liaising with other regulators.
Right, thank you. If I could ask Dr. Snyder another question, if that's all right, Convener. Dr. Snyder, if your organisation is confident in the safety of the vaccines when it grants approval, why were the regulations amended to grant pharmaceutical companies immunity from civil liability?
Thank you. This amendment was made because there was a clause in this which was unclear, and to that extent that immunity would there would be no indemnity. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer. This is why I have to find the right words. The indemnity would be waived for healthcare professionals and for manufacturers, but it did not explicitly mention pharmaceutical companies. So with the principle of equality, so to speak, that was included, but this does not exclude anyone from the normal liability in case of breach of conditions or misconduct or any other items.
Yeah,
it was just a gap in provisions.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your.
Apologies. Apologies. This was basically a gap in the provisions because it mentioned manufacturers and it mentioned healthcare professionals, but it didn't mention pharmaceutical companies as such.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fine. Thank you very much. That's clear. Thank you very much indeed. And my final question is for Professor Pollard. Are other companies, Professor Pollard, likely to follow AstraZeneca's lead and produce the vaccine on a not-for-profit basis?
I don't know the answer to that. My understanding is that Johnson & Johnson are taking that approach, but I mean I'm not really involved in that world of the decision making, so I can't fully answer the question. I think that may be perhaps more for the industry to address.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Would Steve Hall like to come in on that?
Certainly, yes. I think many companies have actually committed to working on a not-for-profit basis, and all of industry is committed to ensuring that this vaccine is made available as an equitable and affordable process. So.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a possibility. Hopefully, that will happen. But I understand from my own business background, there is a question of investment in research and development. So therefore, there has to be each case will presumably be looked at individually.
Yeah, and individual companies will make their decisions.
Yeah.
ABPI can't comment on that.
Thank you, Kavina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maurice. Okay, our next question is from Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning to everyone. I wonder if I could ask a question to begin with, probably to Steve, I think. The constituents ask me, Steve, how come the vaccine has arrived so quickly? How come the clinical trials have been managed to have been completed so quickly? You offer an assurance to our public that the whole process of getting the vaccine approved has been correct and proper and so on and so forth, and that no corners have been cut in bringing the vaccine to the market.
Okay, so it has been done, and I think it's on the back of quite a few things and advancements. So there's the advancements of technology. There was the fact that the genetic sequence was unveiled and shared very, very early on in the process, and the experience that we'd already had with similar viruses, in addition to this unprecedented collaboration between industry and other stakeholders, such as the MHRA, to do things in a kind of a parallel fashion as opposed to a sequential one, which is kind of conventional. Ultimately, you know, the MHRA decides if things have been done in the most appropriate fashion to the highest standards of, in their terms, quality, safety, and efficacy. The industry's role is present that compelling evidence that that has actually been done. So you can be assured that no corners have been cut. What we've done is we've maybe learned some new ways of working. And MHRA, again, for example, they started this process of rolling review 6 months ago, looking at the data as it was coming off, so that it was actually much easier for them to take the final data and come to a decision in a really short period of time. So it's just a different way of working, and there's definitely some things that we can learn for future pandemics here, and even maybe some new ways of working that we can claim as business as usual, which can impact the speed of development of medicines and getting new medicines to patients even quicker than we had before.
That's very reassuring. It's a question I'm posed quite often by constituents, so it's worthwhile trying to get that on the record, that everything was done properly and there's no corners have been cut with this. I wonder if I could ask possibly Professor Lim or any of the other panellists. It's about our shielded group, Professor Lim, those people who have underlying health conditions, no matter their age. Do you think we've got them in the right place in the order of the vaccination rollout, do you think? I know we're correctly targeting our most senior citizens and vulnerable citizens firstly, but for younger people who have underlying health conditions, do you think we're giving them the proper priority in the order of the vaccination rollout?
Thank you. This is a question that many people ask, as you can imagine, particularly people with underlying health conditions. The unique character, I guess, of COVID-19 is the very, very steep association of increasing age with a poor outcome, particularly the risk of dying. A lot of infections obviously affect older people more, but coronavirus does appear to affect older people particularly hard, and the association is not linear but exponential. It's like a wave that goes up very, very steeply. when we've looked at models, looking at the optimal way of delivering a vaccine to maximum benefit to save the most lives, then whether the outcome is to save lives or save lives measured by something called quality adjusted life years, which takes into account how many expected life years somebody might have, then both of those outcomes, you find that the optimal strategy is still to offer vaccination to older adults first. And that is because of this incredibly steep association with age. So that's on the basis of the backbone of the recommendation and the priority groups. We have looked and re-looked at the risk of dying for the group that are in the clinically extremely vulnerable. As a group, they are roughly at the same level of risk as people who are age around 70, 75, that sort of region. And that's why we've placed them alongside that particular group for offer of vaccination.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. Dr. Schneider, did you wish to make a comment on that point there?
Thanks, it was not on this point. I had flagged up for the previous point on the question if corners were cut. So if you consider this sufficiently answered, I would not say more.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have another question, Convener, that I don't think anyone has asked yet. It's about how do we manage the IT side of this, the data management side of this, if we're having millions of people being vaccinated? Where is the IT management of this taking place, and who's doing it to properly record people coming to vaccination centres, to make sure that a record is taken that they've been vaccinated, and to make sure that they come back 3 weeks or a month later to do it? Because I don't think there's a role for our GP surgeries in this process at the moment. So who's managing and delivering the IT side of all of this to make sure that it's all done correctly? I don't know who might answer that. Maybe try Steve.
I don't think I can answer to that level. Okay. But what I can say is that from the manufacturer's point of view and from the MHRA point of view is we certainly monitor after the vaccination. So there's an ongoing safety monitoring process, and the MHRA has this yellow card scheme, which I would definitely encourage everyone to download the app for your phone and to use it once you've had that vaccination. But there's also a process of providing information to those patients every time they've had that vaccination to encourage them to report those effects. In regards to the IT about who's got what, I think that comes down to the NHS and the local governments who are part of that part of the team to get the deployment out.
Okay, I think that's probably a question perhaps for our next panel convener, so I'm happy with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willie. Okay, our next question is from Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, convener. Good morning to our panel. I think my first question would be to Professor Pollard. I understand that the Pfizer vaccine employs a different technology from traditional vaccines, such that the stimulation of production of the viral protein is in our own cells rather than in vats of cells. So the briefing tells us. And perhaps Professor Pollard could explain to a layperson like myself what that actually means, what the implications of that. And secondly, that there already is one clear implication, which is that people who have allergies are being advised not to take the Pfizer vaccine. So what is to happen to this set of people, which I would imagine is not inconsequential these days in terms of other vaccines in pipeline? Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, to explain the different technologies, I mean, there are actually many different technologies that are being used, and the 50 different vaccines that are currently in clinical development. So there isn't really time to go through all of those. The RNA vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine, essentially what they are doing is delivering a small bit of genetic code, which is the code for the spike protein of coronavirus. And so when the vaccine is given, our cells turn that genetic code into spike protein so that our immune system can then make a response. And that works very, very powerfully, as we've seen in the studies on the immune response to the Pfizer vaccine. And the Moderna vaccine, which is one of the other ones the UK has bought, works in exactly the same way. Now, some of the other vaccines, like ours, the viral vector vaccines, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, also a viral vector, does something rather similar. The delivery mechanism for the genetic code is a virus, a common cold virus. But in the end, all of these vaccines are doing the same thing. They're converting a bit of genetic code into spike protein so that the immune system can make a response. So that I don't think that there's nothing sort of magic about it. This is something which is it's a new technology, but the way it actually ends up making the immune response is very similar to some of the other vaccines that are in development and some of the licensed vaccines, like the Ebola vaccines, which are licensed all across Europe.
I thank Professor Pollard for that answer, and it's very helpful to hear from the scientific experts. But just dealing with my second question, therefore, perhaps even more pertinent, what about people who have allergies? What's going to happen to them in terms of getting a vaccine?
Well, I haven't been involved in the discussions about those cases, but it may be that there's an allergy to something specific in the vaccine, or it could even be individuals who are allergic to something else that happens around vaccination, something that's in the syringes, or something that is in the gloves even that are being used. So I don't have a full understanding at this moment about what the nature of that allergy is, and it's being investigated at the moment. And I think there's clearly a sensible precaution while that's looked into to pause in that group. But I don't think that means that we're not going to have this dealt with in the longer term so that people can be protected.
I thank Professor Pollard for that answer, which provides some reassurance for that. Turning to the MHRA and Dr. Schneider, I was pleased to hear that he referred to the fact that obviously the MHRA works with bodies on an international basis. I just wonder if he could though clarify, just for our reassurance, that would extend to information sharing to avoid duplication, and it's not just liaison. And secondly, what is happening with regard to the least developed countries in this whole process? Perhaps Dr. Schneider could share his views and information.
Thank you. So indeed, the information sharing is on the basis indeed of where we have a confidentiality agreement with other regulators, and we do have these in place with quite a number of them. And we have to explore how we can share information and liaise also with countries beyond the International Coalition for Medicines Regulators, for example, and US FDA or the European Medicines Agency. Indeed, this is a very valid question, and we are currently exploring this. If I may, just to add on your previous question about the allergy. So indeed, there were 2 cases of anaphylaxis, which is the kind of highest grade you can have in an allergic reaction. And to my knowledge, it is any person with a history of anaphylaxis to a vaccine, medicine, or food that should not receive this. And if there is a history of severe or serious allergies, that this should be discussed with the healthcare professional. It is not on allergies, it is on severe allergies. But of course, again, we cannot exclude that there is an allergic reaction. We are looking into this, into the mechanism of why this came about. And it is not unexpected that these cases occur when you expose many, many people within a short period of time. And I should maybe also reassure that this also shows that our strong system that we have in the UK on pharmacovigilance actually works. So we were able to also act on it, to put out recommendations so that everything is in hand.
I thank Dr. Schneider for that answer. Turning briefly to Professor Lim at the JCVI, I just wanted to clarify the priority approach adopted by the JCVI. Is that kind of reflected in the approach of the international approach and the approach that other countries are taking in broad brush? Perhaps Professor Lim could confirm the position.
Thank you. Yes, in short, the answer is other countries have adopted, or many other countries have adopted very, very similar recommendations to JCVI, which is to prioritize mainly on age, first of all, and to protect the vulnerable and protect people from the severe effects of COVID-19.
Okay, that's helpful because we do get a lot of questions. I think you've seen the flavour of that this morning, Professor Lim, about priority, and it is I think a reasonable proposition to suggest that actually this is the approach that by and large the world is taking based on clinical observation. I know my time is just about up. I have one last question to Mr. Haw, and it was actually a comment made, I think, by a young postgraduate student at the time that the Oxford vaccine information was starting to show a lot of promise. And she was very, very excited. I remember hearing an interview on the radio. She was really, really excited. And she was excited also because of the importance of the scientific community working together for a common good. And she extrapolated that if we could maintain this momentum, then we could see massive strides in, for example, vaccinating against malaria. I wonder, from the industry point of view, if Mr. Hall could comment, what concrete actions and reflections are now, being taken forward to take this momentum and do something good with it for mankind?
Very, very, very good question, and it is very, very exciting. I mean, we have seen unprecedented levels of collaboration and cooperation between industry members and academia and regulators and other stakeholders, and some real new science. We're going to learn a lot from this in terms of new technologies and new ways of working. So I would be very surprised if we didn't see these knock-on effects in other diseases and other approaches. Not just malaria, but things like our worry is antimicrobial resistance. So there could be ways of working here to overcome barriers that we've come across in the past. So absolutely right to be excited. It's a very exciting time to be involved in science, and I'm really hoping one of the knock-on effects is that we see more people taking an interest in our science and what we do, and a whole new generation of students and pupils getting involved in STEM subjects.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, particularly women. We need to see many more women in STEM. But I do think this is a really important point. If we can take things that happened over the last year and a bit longer to come and take some positives, this must be a positive. And the world will be watching and expecting much more collaboration, I think, on the part of the scientific and pharma community. But I think my time is up, so thank you very much for your response, and thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Now, I've had an indication from Mark Ruskell, who has a supplementary question, so if we can maybe squeeze it in and hopefully get some brief answers to that would be great. So, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I think it actually follows on nicely from that last question, because I'm wondering sort of how this collaboration is taking place on the ground, and on what basis? Is it purely commercial? Are there other ways to share IP and technology? And I'm thinking in particular about whether UK Pharma is fully bedded into the WHO COVID technology access pool, whether that's something which UK Pharma is committing to. I mean, obviously there'll be discussions at board level about, but the bottom line, the financial bottom line, but it seems now there's a chance for real global altruism on this, and I'm interested to know how you're actually working with those WHO initiatives. For Steve, I think.
So yes, a lot of UK industry are actually global companies, and we've already made that commitment to to work. And I mentioned previously the COVAX facility that was set up by WHO, and I'm personally involved at the international level with the IFPMA, our kind of sister trade association. So we're seeing that cooperation going on right now around not just the vaccines, but that kind of that general new ways of working. And we've certainly seen the regulators do the same thing. So the MHRA are quite prevalent at the international level as well. There's a group called ICMRA, which is an international coalition of regulators, and the MHRA are quite prevalent in that as well. So it is a very, very exciting time, like we've said previously, and absolutely there's a commitment from the industry to fair and equitable and affordable access to medicines going forward.
Any final comments on that from our witnesses? Okay, well that brings our question and answer session to a close and concludes our consideration of this agenda item. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for their evidence and their time this morning. It's been very helpful, so thank you. I will now suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses, and we'll have a comfort break of around 5 minutes for members' convenience. So thank you to our witnesses today, and see you in a few minutes. We will now move on to agenda item 2. Under this agenda item, the committee will be taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, MSP, and Professor Jason Leach, the National Clinical Director in the Scottish Government. We will be covering a lot of matters this morning, including the latest ministerial statement on COVID-19 and the 2 monthly reports to Parliament under the Coronavirus Scotland Act. The committee will also consider the following made affirmative instruments: the Health Protection, Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements, Local Level Scotland, Amendment number 5, Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/400, the Health Protection, Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements, Local Levels Scotland, Amendment number 6, Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/415, and the Health Protection, Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements, Local Level Scotland, Amendment number 7, Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/247. Finally, the committee will consider the draft regulations arising from this week's review, which are entitled the Health Protection, Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements, Miscellaneous Amendments, Scotland Regulations 2020. Cabinet Secretary, I welcome you to the meeting, and can I invite you to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I'm sorry there is so much to consider today, and I'll be certainly brief as I can. This had the 6th review of the allocation of levels. That review again followed a cautious approach, especially in advance of the festive arrangements, with the majority of local authorities remaining at their current level. This is, however, against the background of several of the indicators the framework uses having seen rises in the last week across a number of local authorities. 3 local authorities moved from level 2 to level 3 from tomorrow: Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and East Lothian. We also confirmed, in recognition of the low incidences of COVID, as a means to combat social isolation, we decided to relax restrictions on the in-home socialising in a number of Argyll and Bute Islands. These islands will now be able to follow the 6.2 rules that currently apply to many islands in level 1 areas. We had, however, concerns regarding increasing case numbers in some other local authority areas, and we're continuing to keep those situations under review. We've already confirmed that there will be a review next week, but our general aim from this week's allocation remains that the level should be in place until the first review point in January. However, should changes be needed within that period, which is not our intention or wish, I have, of course, offered to make myself available to the committee were it to decide to meet during the recess. Let me return to the regulations. There are 3 sets, as you say. The first set ensures students are able to leave their current place of residence at the end of term. They also make provision for the festive bubble arrangements and allow holiday arrangements to be used in level 4 areas for some specific reasons. These regulations make adjustments to the level allocation in 16 areas of Scotland set out in the First Minister's statement last week. They also allow in-home socialising to take place in certain islands, and they adjust travel restrictions to Jersey and the Republic of Ireland. The general miscellaneous amendments regulations are the draft amendments. They implement the changes announced in the First Minister's statement on Tuesday, make a tweak to the rules regarding marriage receptions and funeral wakes in levels 0 and 1. They also adjust the Health Protection, Coronavirus Protection from Eviction Scotland Regulations 2020. These amendment regulations set out that the period in which a social housing eviction order decree for rent arrears must be executed is extended by the duration of the eviction ban, and they'll come into force, all these regulations, at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Well, finally, the 4th report to the Parliament was published last week with a statement from myself, covers the period to the end of the 30th of November. Over and above the reporting requirements set out in the Acts, we've reported in more detail on the set 22 statutory provisions, which we judge at this time to be of most impact of interest to the Parliament for other reasons. We've also reported on a total of 60 SSIs, where the main purpose relates to coronavirus as required under Section 14 of the Act. We are, I hope, demonstrating that accountability is integral to our efforts to suppress the virus. These reports also include the 3rd report to Parliament on freedom of information, and I'm happy to discuss that. Finally, Convener, and I'm sure you'll be pleased it is finally, looking ahead to the new year, I am very mindful that only one further renewal of these statutory provisions is possible under the terms of the original Coronavirus Act, and that if that were renewed, it would expire at the end of September 2021. As I said in response to Donald Cameron in the Parliament last week, I think the appropriate time to take a view on whether any further extension will be required will be when we come to the next 2-monthly reporting process at the end of January. I would emphasise it remains the government's intention, absolutely, to have these exceptional provisions in place for no longer than is necessary. But equally, it's essential that we continue to have the tools we need to deal with the consequences of the COVID pandemic, as we have seen this week. That is a difficult balancing act. We will all need to think carefully about what we should do in the run-up to the expiry of the provisions at the end of March. And of course, Parliament will have the final say on any extension. And I hope all that is helpful, if a little lengthy.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll be turning to questions. Just to remind members, there is a lot to cover today. We have approximately 8 minutes for each question and the answers, so if we can all be concise as possible, that would be really helpful. If there is time for supplementaries, like in the last item, I'll try and take them at the end, so please indicate that in the chat function. Cabinet Secretary, you've touched on the 2 monthly report, so we're considering the latest one this morning, and the next reporting period end will be close to the expiry of the Coronavirus Scotland Act. Reflecting on the use of the powers over the past 2 months and their ongoing necessity, can you say a little bit more about what the government or what plans government is currently making for extending the Act beyond the 31st of March? And given the significance of the next extension period covering a dissolution of a pre-election recess period, will the government ensure that Parliament has 40 days to consider an extension of the legislation if this is requested by the Scottish Government?
It certainly would be my hope that we can stick to all the regulations that we have in terms of consideration. And I think I've made it crystal clear in what I said, Convener, that the Parliament will have the final say on this. And that's absolutely correct. We will have to balance the situation as it exists at the time with our expectation of what will take place. Now, on the positive side, we have the rollout of the virus taking place. Vaccine taking place. You've just had evidence on that. This is an important step, and that will be helpful. On the downside, we are in a more difficult position this Christmas than many of us hoped to be, even 3 months ago. So we have to be mindful of the fact that many of the things that we have in the regulations are needed and will remain needed. I'd like a full and open discussion of this. The committee might want to have a session in which we discuss this and only this, and we look at the details. When we report at the end of January, that will be a good time to do so. Of course, we can't pick and choose from the bill. What we can do is we can switch provisions off. We can't put new things into the bill, nor can we make things permanent in the bill, which is good. So we have a series of decisions to make. As you say, at the end of March, we will then be going into an election period. We're making special arrangements for that in another bill. So we will need to be mindful of what we can and can't do. And I hope we can approach that together as parliamentarians and find a way forward.
That's helpful. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned the rollout of the vaccine, and we had a very useful session on that this morning. Can I ask, does the Scottish Government have any concerns about the potential impact of Brexit on the vaccine supply chain? Perhaps give us an update on what discussions are taking place between the Scottish Government and the UK Government to that effect.
I answered a question on this in the chamber yesterday from Pauline McNeill, and of course, we would all be concerned about that. But there is a very strong determination by all the governments of these islands to prioritise the delivery of the vaccine. And you'll have seen press coverage about the arrangements are being made for that to directly airship it, if necessary, by military aircraft into various airports for it to be very much a Category 1 product and prioritised in that way. There are, I don't think it would be a surprise to anybody in this committee to know there are strong tensions between the governments of these islands on a whole range of issues. But on the issue of the rollout of the vaccine, as on many of the issues, it has been a very strong attempt to work closely together and to benefit from each other's experience, knowledge and determination. So I am as confident as I can be, and I know the Cabinet Secretary of Health is in the same position, that the vaccine rollout will continue according to plan, as indeed it must.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Okay, I'll turn to questions from members. First of all, we have Mark Wisco.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted just to ask Professor Leach about the situation in Edinburgh, because looking at the figures over the last week, I think it completely vindicates the government's position that Edinburgh needed to stay at level 3 and not drop down to level 2. But I wanted to ask you what you see as the wider trends within our larger conurbations, because we see quite a few areas moving, say, from level 4 to level 3, but then appearing quite sticky in that in terms of the indicators. So what do you think is influencing that? Is it shopping? Is it relaxation of restrictions? What should we be mindful of going forward?
Thank you, Ruskell, and hello everybody again. Thank you for having me. It's an excellent question, and one the world is finding tricky, actually. And if you look at every mainstream country, let's call it, that has developed some kind of level structure, whether it's the Republic of Ireland or France or Germany or even Australia, everybody is struggling with exactly where that balance sits, and that balance appears to be different in urban and rural. We discussed that a little bit last week. And it also seems to be different depending on when you come into a level and where you leave. So we've created this slightly artificial argument about the range of data in which you should enter a level and which you should leave a level. Of course, the reality is much more dynamic than that. So should you enter when you're at the bottom? So should we wait until you're near the bottom of level 2 before you get into level 2? Should you not move out of level 2 until you are quite sustainably in level 1? And I think that's the kind of thing we're learning, as we've only been doing this a few weeks. I think over the next few weeks, the plan is, well, I know the plan is not only to have reviews as we've had, but also to review the processes, the nature of those reviews. So should we add other elements of data? Should we add something about the dynamic nature of the data rather than this obvious attachment to having a fixed point? So if you get under 100, you become level X. It is, of course, not as simple as that, because a local authority the size of Edinburgh with X 100,000 people doesn't behave as simply as that. So we're going to try and refine that with advice to give to the decision makers, and then the decision makers will choose whether to take said advice. The second part of your question about what drives that, it's so difficult, as you and I have discussed many times. I don't think it's one thing. I think it is, as you move down through our levels, the English tiers, whatever you might want to call them, you bring people together. And there isn't any question that when you bring people together, particularly when your prevalence is still at a relatively high level, the virus accelerates. And all of the curves we see globally are fast up, slow down, because it is much slower because of the incubation period to reduce the virus prevalence, and it's so easy to get exponential growth because of the R number infecting one person, infecting multiple others. And you can see that from this horrid virus. I wish it were not like that, but it's the nature of the infectious agent. And that's why the levels are a relatively blunt tool, Mr. Ruskell, as we've discussed many times. So level 3 is about reducing interaction more than level 2. Level 2 is about reducing interaction more than level 1. And that's why it tries to tackle all of those elements: hospitality, retail, gyms and exercise, wherever people come together, it's an attempt to do that. That balance won't be completely correct, of course, but it is our best attempt to do that. And I think we're getting better.
Okay, thanks for that. I'd like to turn to the issue of the modelling of the Christmas relaxation rules that were now, being brought to this committee and number 6 regulations this morning. And I'm still trying to understand what level of modelling has actually been done here. I mean, I heard Chris Whitty the other day say that there's been lots of modelling around the impact of different numbers of people mixing in different settings. I'm not seeing that evidence being brought to this committee or any kind of assessment of the 4 harms. So I'm asking again, what evidence, you don't want to call it a risk assessment, call it a risk assessment, but what evidence, what modelling has there been around the impact of the Christmas relaxation regulations?
I wonder if
I think Jason Leach. I think Jason Leach should address that quite clearly. Part of this is evidential in terms of past experience. We have seen what will happen when people get together, where the capability is for the virus to spread between them. That's some of this is axiomatic because we have stopped people gathering in each other's homes because we know that that is a factor. Ergo, if people gather in each other's homes, even in limited numbers and in bubbles, that will have an effect. But Jason might want to say more about the detail of this and the science behind it and the experience behind it, because it is based upon the experience of this virus now for 9 months. That's not a long time, but it is based upon that experience.
I'm afraid the fairly blunt answer to your question, Mr. Ruskell, is it's so difficult to model. BIEM, which is the UK-wide modelling committee that feeds into SAGE, BIB for behavioural science, BIEM for modelling, feeding into SAGE, and then we have equivalents of that feeding into our scientific advisory group. There is, of course, Chris is right, there is lots of modelling. And the modelling that's published every week by the Scottish Government is an attempt to try and do some of that about bed usage, about ICU impact. The tricky thing is to model this 5-day period and what will happen. We know from polling that somewhere between 50 and 60% of people say they're not going to do anything different from what their levels say. 25% are pretty convinced that we should let people do as they please. The difficulty in there is to work out what the present prevalence in each of the areas, because if you do in-house mixing in Orkney, that will be different if a lot of Londoners arrive. It will not be as bad if no Londoners arrive. So the presumptions, the feeding into the black box of the modelling is so difficult. We've tried to do it as best we can, and fundamentally, the more mixing, the higher prevalence, the less mixing, the lower prevalence. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. That's everybody now knows that. So difficult to be accurate, and the judgment was made, as the First Minister said once again yesterday, as you heard the 4 leaders of the 4 UK countries say, that the judgment was it was better to have some relaxation and some advice rather than none.
Thank
Okay.
you. Okay. Is there a next question? Annabel Ewing.
And good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and Professor Leach. First question, picking up actually I raised I think some weeks ago. Start with Professor Leach can add his comments should he wish, and that is Hogmanay. We're kind of looking at Christmas, but of course Hogmanay is coming up very shortly thereafter, and I suppose the message will be don't do Hogmanay. But I do recall that for Halloween, for example, that there was some kind of specific guidance issued, and I just wonder what the Scottish Government is planning with regard to Hogmanay, when actually a lot of stuff, even in Scotland, happens outdoors, but equally the kind of stuff that happens outdoors is probably not the kind of stuff that you would be encouraging. So perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could start that one off.
Don't do Hogmanay. That's the advice. Don't do Hogmanay. I mean, obviously, if somebody can meet out of doors, they are permitted to meet out of doors, and maybe they would wish to meet out of doors at midnight or whatever. But you don't, in any sense, do it if you don't feel you should do it. If you do it, then absolutely, the social distancing rules, the rules that apply within the area you live, have to be applied by, absolutely and to the letter. But there is no relaxation at Hogmanay. We are saying to people at Christmas very, very clearly, only do it if you feel you have to do it for the reasons of the other harms. And the First Minister was clear yesterday about how restrained that should be. Please try to avoid staying in other people's houses. There's a whole don't feel you have to do it. Keep the numbers, even lower than are permitted. And when it comes to Hogmanay, there is no relaxation. No ifs, no buts. There is no relaxation of the requirements of the area in which you live. As you say, people can mix out of doors. but it is very limited in numbers. And if people feel that they should not, and there is any risk at all, and there will be risk, then they should be very, very careful indeed about the decisions they make. I mean, there's a great element of common sense in it. The vaccine is becoming available. We are in the midst of a very difficult period. The relaxation at Christmas was much discussed and much debated, and even there, new guidance is indicating how limited that should be. There is no arrangement for Hogmanay, no ifs, no buts. So the rules pertaining to the time are what happens. Many of you will have seen some of the BBC reporting this morning on parties. The vast majority of people are observing this. But people who aren't are putting themselves and others at serious risk, including risk of death. And they need to be reminded of that constantly. And there are legal sanctions available, and they are applied.
Okay, I think that's very clear. Don't do Hogmanay. A question perhaps for Professor Leach, but again, if the Cabinet Secretary wishes to comment at the end, that would also be welcome. In terms of the flu vaccine rollout, I just wonder, what is the current thinking in terms of how long that is pursued when hopefully we will see further supplies arriving of vaccine, be it Pfizer or any other duly approved vaccine, and at what point do you switch resource if you feel that that is something that would need to or would be beneficial, looking at the respective potential harms issue? Perhaps Professor Leach could give his thoughts on the current thinking on that.
Yes, so let me just add a sentence or two to Hogmanay, to Mr Russell, and underline his very clear advice. Hogmanay is not cancelled, but gatherings at Hogmanay are cancelled. So you should celebrate, just like we've not cancelled Mother's Day, not cancelled Easter, and not cancelled Halloween. You can't cancel these wonderful, systematic annual events, Eid, Hanukkah, Christmas, but they are different this year, and Hogmanay will be very different. Our challenge here was, particularly with Christmas relaxation, potential increased prevalence, to then add another relaxation 7 days later would have potentially spread that positivity further around. So that's why our advice was very strongly that Hogmanay shouldn't have the same relaxation. So your flu COVID vaccine point is an excellent one. The first good news is that flu so far on whatever this is this the 17th of December perhaps? On the 17th of December, flu remains unseasonally low, which is excellent news. Not entirely unexpected. The Southern Hemisphere had a good flu season, and we're all washing our hands, we're all keeping distant, and we're all cleaning our surfaces. That will help with other infectious diseases. Flu is not here, but it is quite low. The flu vaccination continues through the winter. We always say that, so it's not too late to get your flu vaccine. But a lot of the flu vaccination is done, and it's tailing off into December and January. But you should still get it if you're invited to go, and you should still get it if you haven't gone and have been invited, because it will still protect you into February and March, when flu could still be around and still cause you serious harm, particularly if you're in a senior group. The difference here is COVID vaccine just now, when we don't have hundreds of thousands of doses, is a relatively niche market. So we've got people specifically doing COVID vaccination in hospitals and care homes. We're not doing it in GP practices yet. We're not doing it in mass vaccination centres. We will, and that's when we'll begin to think about what the workforce, and we're planning for exactly that. As flu vaccination falls away, then we'll be able to replace that with COVID. Just now, this Pfizer one is not really suitable for GP practices because you need 975 doses. You need to find 975 people to vaccinate, and you need to do it fast. That works if you have a big centre, not a small centre. But the AstraZeneca one, we're hopeful, once we get all the regulations, that will be able to be in GP practices, that will be able to be in dental surgeries, that will be able to be all over the country much, much faster. But it's all dependent on supply.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Leach. I think I didn't note the time that I started, but I suspect that might be my time up, convener, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Happy to return to Annabelle if we have more time at the end. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could start off with my usual question about Ayrshire, if I may, probably to Professor Leach. We noticed that the test positivity rates, Professor Leach, for East Ayrshire and South Ayrshire have dropped below the Scottish average now, which is really, really welcome, but North Ayrshire seems to have exceeded that by quite a bit between the 4th and the 11th of December. Are we worried at all about Ayrshire or parts of Ayrshire, and are we worried about this spiking that we're seeing between the 4th and the 11th of December?
Yes, we are. Sunday, Monday, the Deputy First Minister and Ms Campbell had a series of local authority calls supported by clinical advisors, including me, and most of them were about conversations around people who were either moving up or moving down, and you could make up that list yourself. There was about 11 of them. So we spoke to Edinburgh, as you would expect. We spoke to Midlothian. We spoke to East Lothian. But we also had a number of, let's call them watch list local authorities. And one of those was North Ayrshire. So we had a call with North Ayrshire on exactly this point. Not at the stage of thinking we want to go up a level, but just a conversation to say to both the political leaders and the officials, the chief executive of the local authority, to say, look, we see the numbers, we know you see the numbers too. Is there anything we can do? Is there something about local messaging? Is there something about maybe sending environmental health out around the clubs, around the whatever it happens to be, and getting reassurance from the local authority that not only are we giving them all the support they require, but also they're doing everything. And as we learn in local authorities around the whole country, we're able to share best practice. COSLA is able to help us with that, around what that means in North Ayrshire. So the fundamental answer to your question is yes. Particularly in North Ayrshire, we do see a rise, translating both into prevalence and to positivity, and we are keeping a very, very close eye on those numbers. Remember, the secret here is whatever level you're in, it's about interaction. So if something is allowed, it doesn't mean you should do it. It means you should think very carefully before you do it and then be safe when you do so. But you're right, Mr. Coffey, you're clearly paying attention.
Thank you for that. I mean, we are worried. I mean, North Ayrshire residents use Cross House Hospital in Kilmarnock, as you know, which is in Ayrshire. So there was always a bit of a concern that because the parts of the county were split in different tiers, that they were still mixing and mingling pretty much, particularly coming to Cross House Hospital. Are you keeping an eye on that just to see if there's any further impact on that?
Yeah, so the infection, hospital type infections, the healthcare type infections are following pretty much community prevalence. So it is almost impossible to keep it out of institutions if it is in the community, whether that's a call centre or a hospital. You can try really hard, and we try and build protective barriers around these institutions, whether it's a workplace or a hospital. But in reality, community prevalence often leads to outbreaks of some description, whether that's in a prison, in a police cell, and wherever it happens to be. So we know that it is still safe to go to healthcare if you have to do it, and we've got green and red paths, and you should not avoid healthcare. We've also increased hugely the number of video conference appointments, and you can do them from your own home, they can do them from your workplace, and that's been a huge revolution across the health service, which I think actually we'll hold on to in the future, because it's so much more convenient to many, many people to save them travelling. But people should continue to go. They shouldn't be scared of Cross House Hospital, but they should be careful when they go to Cross House Hospital. They should take face coverings. They should wash their hands. They should, when they go back into their car, they should have hand sanitizer, etc., etc.
Good. I wonder if I could ask a question that I don't think has been asked in this process, and it's about the IT or the data management of the vaccine rollout programme, and who's doing it basically. Who's communicating with people, who's recording that they've been for a vaccine, if it's not the GP surgeries, data kind of management services, who's actually doing that and who'll manage that?
So fortunately, and by design, the director in charge of vaccination is Caroline Lamb. Caroline Lamb is the former Finance Director of NHS Education for Scotland and then the Chief Executive of NHS Education for Scotland. She came into the government a number of months ago to run digital for us in health and social care, but since COVID has clearly been redirected first to testing and now to vaccination. And her heart, would you believe, is in digital. So along with the vaccination rollout, she has had a parallel work stream of apps, of data management, of all of the things you would expect. And I had a meeting with them relatively recently, and they are based in NHS Education for Scotland, and they have designed the data collection processes to embed inside the NHS. And it's really, really good. I was very impressed. It's the same group, not the individual, same group who designed the Protect Scotland app, who have done a lot of the testing data for us, and now have done a lot of that vaccination data. So there is a dashboard that's confidential, of course, that monitors who is being vaccinated, when they will then need their second appointment, because you need 2 doses, where those people are. Is it a care home individual? Is it a health and social care worker? And we have CAI numbers. So we're very, very grateful for that long history of individual identification numbers for every person in Scotland in the health service. Not every country has that. That is hugely valuable when we get to a point like this, when we need to know in a register who's had X and when did they have it. So that allows us to incorporate that into this digital exercise. So actually, the digital is one of our key work streams and is working very well. There will be blips, as there were in the last 24 hours around Protect Scotland. Of course there will. It's not perfect, but it is good.
Good. That's really encouraging. My last query, if possible, Convener, it's possibly to the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I met the directors of Kilmarnock Football Club last week, and one of the things that they and others are asking for is what a roadmap might look like for football supporters to get back into stadiums. And they weren't asking for dates and specifics and stuff like that. They were just asking if we're working on what a potential roadmap might look like for the fans of all these sports to be able to get back and see whatever particular sport and club that they would like to see. So are we doing any work on that at the moment to give them any kind of assurance that we're thinking about it?
Well, of course, the levels that we have indicate the route map which restrictions are eased down to a position of almost normality, certainly. And that is the route map that's in existence. So I think they should, first of all, be assured that there is a way forward to do that. But secondly, of course, and we've seen from the work that Joe Fitzpatrick has been doing in terms of support for football, there is a great deal of work going on to make sure that there is support for clubs and for spectators so that can move towards some form of normality. So I think in every sector, every minister involved with every part of their portfolio is looking to see that they can fully understand what things will look like and how they will be laid out. So I'm absolutely sure that Joe can reassure them of that, and I would encourage you to engage with him.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you for answering those questions. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Our next question is from Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary Professor Leach. According to the National Audit Office this week, NHS England and NHS Improvement is planning on the assumption it could vaccinate up to 25 million people with 2 doses throughout 2021. Do we have figures for Scotland?
Professor Leach, I think Professor Leach would be the right person to answer this.
So we've tried not to set targets for very good reason, because we just simply don't know about vaccine supply. We are encouraged by the early stages, and we're encouraged by the relationship with the companies and the way that is working on a 4-country level. The procurement is good. We have invested correctly in the vaccines that seem to be coming. We have said publicly that we want to vaccinate 4.5 million people. That's 9 million doses, roughly. And we don't know where those 9 million doses will come from yet. We can't know, but we're very hopeful that the AstraZeneca vaccine will be a big bulk of that, because at a 4-country level we have invested in 100 million doses, of AstraZeneca, but that needs regulation approval, it needs approval to distribute, and it needs manufactured. And it needs manufactured in huge numbers. And it needs to also go to Belgium and Senegal and Austria. So we need to be careful not to set unrealistic targets, but we are aiming in 2021 to vaccinate 4.5 million people twice.
Thank you. No, I understand that it's not wise to set unrealistic targets. Can I ask about vaccinating priority groups? The JCVI recommends vaccinating all individuals aged 16 to 64 years with underlying health conditions, which put them at a higher risk of serious disease and mortality. And they would be in sixth priority after all those aged 65 years of age and over. So how will it be decided who those people are and what priority they'll be given to be vaccinated?
So 9 groups announced by the JCVI. Now that, we have to be slightly careful because that is the existing JCVI advice, and that's based on what we know now about vaccine. So don't get entirely surprised if the JCVI change their advice over time, as you would expect them to do for the measles vaccine or the yellow fever vaccine. For now, with what we know about vaccination, immunity and risk from COVID, they have said 9 groups with a 10th group at the bottom, which is everybody left under 50. So at the over 65s group, which is group, let me just look over here, group 5, the over 65s, once you've done all your over 65s, which includes everybody who was previously shielding, what we now call the clinically extremely vulnerable group, they are done with the over 75s. So once you've done your over 65s, your risk of death graph, it's horrible, but that's how you do it. You do it based on risk of death. You move down to the over 60s, and in that group, you add the high-risk group. Basically, those who get the flu vaccine will be how we roughly do that. And there may be some nuance around the edges of that based on COVID risk rather than flu risk. And we don't have to do that tomorrow, remember. This will be some months ahead. And we will know more about the disease and about the nature of the vaccine by then. But in rough terms, those who get the flu vaccine who are 16 and above will get the vaccine with the over 60s. The idea being that in general risk terms, their risk is about the same as the over 60s risk. It's not completely accurate, of course it isn't. But in rough terms, that's where they fit in the scheme. I'm drawing this graph because the paper that decided this is a graph like that. So very high risk in the over 80s, and that risk falls as your age falls, and you add in disease as you go up the graph.
I think that's helpful for people who have had the flu vaccine. They'll have a pretty good idea of where they might fall in that. That's helpful. My final question, can I ask if there's an update on recent figures on the number of people who have been fined for breaching travel restrictions and bearing in mind the importance of adhering to the travel restrictions, and especially in light of what the Cabinet Secretary said about Hogmanay?
I have no detail on the travel restrictions part of this, but I can give you the update to the 9th of December on the policing figures, which overall I think are important. And that there have been 6,126 fixed penalty notices from the 27th of March to the 9th of December. And then we go from dispersed when informed, which is the figure they publish of 67,262, dispersed but only when instructed 18,819, dispersed using reasonable force 636. 6,126 fixed penalty notices and 486 people arrested. Now, the subset of that will be those who have been had notices in terms of travel, and it would be an operational matter for Police Scotland to break those down even further. As you can see, the 4Es is not only the underpinning guidance, but actually it's a useful guidance because it does show that people are capable of being persuaded that and informed, and it's only at the very end you will have enforcement.
Thank you. Helpful answers. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Our next question is from John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. Professor Leach, you said that we need 9 million doses, but we heard at the previous session that the UK is ordering 5 doses per person. So it looks like we'll have 25. We could have 25 million available. Can you comment on why the UK is ordering so much, and is that not disadvantaging poorer countries?
It's an excellent point, Mr. Mason. Well made. The reason we have effectively put our chips on different manufacturers is we don't know who's going to get first, and we don't know how many they're going to have. So initially, until we know what this virus does in the longer term and whether it comes back, whether we have to keep vaccinating people over time, etc., we need the first sets of vaccines, and every country in the world needs exactly that. So you can imagine a world in which we get 2 million of Moderna, we get 2 million of AstraZeneca, and we get 1 million of Pfizer, and that would allow us to vaccinate half of our population. What the procurement, the vaccine committee decided to do was to not put all the chips on one vaccine, because that vaccine, of course, could fail at any point, and it could fail manufacturing. So it could fail regulation, it could fail trials, it could fail in manufacturing. So that's why there's a broad approach to the procurement. So in reality, we probably won't get 25 million doses. We will probably get somewhere between the 9 and the 25 that we require. To your other point, I have been very concerned about vaccine hoarding around Western Europe and other developed countries, but I am very reassured by the WHO's engagement on this issue. The WHO have a specific piece of work around global vaccination. They have sought donor countries, and the UK, my understanding, last time I looked, the UK was the biggest donor country to the fund, and it is to effectively buy vaccine at cost price from the main drug companies, and the WHO will then deal with supply, with distribution, with all those other things you would expect. Pfizer and AstraZeneca have both said publicly that they will make X proportion of the vaccine available at cost price through that WHO procurement to the likes of Yemen and Ethiopia and Senegal, who simply wouldn't be able to do what we've been able to do. So I am very reassured. I think I've said in this committee before that Tedros, who's the Director General, said a few weeks ago when he was launching this, he said we should vaccinate some people in all countries before we vaccinate all people in some countries. And he's correct. This is a global problem. It's not a Scottish problem. It is, of course, a Scottish problem, but it is much, much bigger than us.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. That's helpful. Thanks. Move on to a different subject. We recently had the mass testing in certain areas, and one of them was Dalmarnock in my own constituency. Can you tell us what we've learned from the mass testing? I mean, from what I saw, the figures, there weren't huge numbers that were found positive.
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting exercise. You'll remember we discussed at the committee when we were launching this programme that we had decided to do things slightly differently from some other parts of the world and not go for whole population mass testing in a city or in a region. We decided to go to particularly high prevalence areas, and we chose them from the public health dashboard that everybody can see. Dalmarnock, Pollokshields, Clackmannanshire, a couple of areas in Ayrshire. And it has proven to be very, very useful, particularly actually in the Clackmannanshire outbreak. And that's why the Clackmannanshire numbers look so high, because we've found quite a lot of asymptomatics. We've found some in Dalmarnock and Pollokshields, not enormous numbers, you're absolutely correct. But every positive is interrupting a chain of transmission. So that's a good thing. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've been able to drive down that level 4 plus that testing in specific targeted areas to offer that to the population, particularly when it's easily accessible, where local communication is good, where the local authority and the community leaders can help us with that. So I think it's been a very good example of how we can use, I don't particularly like the phrase mass testing because it doesn't really describe it. It's targeted testing. And I think we will continue to do that particularly with PCR testing, which is our most reliable test, and that's been helpful. I think it's one of the reasons why you see Glasgow's numbers fall. It's not the only reason, it's about behaviour, but it's one of the reasons why Glasgow's numbers have fallen pretty well over the last few weeks.
Were you happy with the number of people that came forward for testing?
Yeah, I would always want more. Of course, I'd like to queue them all up in a big line test them all. But actually, I can't remember the most recent percentage. I'd have to look it up. But it was compared to some of the global city testing, it was much higher. And it reached, forgive the shorthand, it reached some harder to reach groups that we were worried about, that are sometimes either difficult to get to for whatever reason, be it their own lives or our design of our services where people have to travel. So we tried to do it as local as we could. We got a lot of help from local community leaders, be that mosques or churches or community centres or local authority politicians, to help us with that local communication. And I thought it was quite an encouraging set of circumstances that got us something. Of course, I'd rather more came forward, of course.
And my third and final area would be to ask about the student testing that's been going on before they go home. Has that been, there's been a good uptake, and how's that been going?
There's been an excellent uptake. I think the big headline news there is very few positives. Now, we know that lateral flow testing is not as sensitive as PCR testing, but it is not sensitive at all. It gets about 65% of the potential positives, and we have found some, but actually not many. So that would suggest that the student population are following the guidance and following the rules, and things are going well in the student population. Gives us some assurance, not 100% assurance, gives us some assurance that when they go home, they will be safer than they would have been. And we've broken the chains of transmission in the ones who did test positive with lateral flow, retested them with PCR, self-isolating them and their households. So I think, again, it's another layer of protection. And we're going to do the same on the staggered re-entry. So the staggered re-entry of students coming back, again, 2 lateral flow tests, hopefully 1 nearer home, and then 1 when they get back to their universities. And that's what we're discussing and negotiating, both with the student body and the institutions.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Turn now to Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Can I just take back the question of Faz Lane and the submarine base, which is near to my heart in my area? It seems good news there that the cases have gone down from 96 to 37. Now, this shows obviously clearly the strategy for industrial sites is working. Would you, Professor Leach, like to comment on that?
Yeah, so this has been a very, very complex outbreak, as you can imagine, with lots of hierarchical leadership in there, including the local Director of Public Health, the Scottish Government, but also the Ministry of Defence, the local leaders inside the base. I think it's been very well dealt with. Those who were positive were isolated. It's a slightly different environment, of course, because of the nature of the workplace, but so is a chicken processing plant or a call centre or a hospital. So we adapted our instructions and our guidance to that local environment. Fortunately, last time I got a report, there was nobody seriously unwell, which is, of course, the most important thing. It's a relatively young and fit cohort, but still, that doesn't entirely keep them safe. We haven't seen, and this is the crucial thing, I think, for your constituents, Mr. Corrie, is we haven't seen onward community transmission of any meaningful size. So they have managed to control that environment inside the workplace. They've supported those who were positive to self-isolate, and I think it's been very well handled by that multi-worker element of the environment, including a UK government, Scottish government liaison, as well as the local Director of Public Health. I think it's been very well done.
That's very interesting indeed, and it's very good to hear that, because my concern, and certainly my constituents' concern, is the question of onward transmission, particularly when you're a parent who's serving there or working in the base who comes home, and therefore kids are going to the local schools. That clearly has not come to follow through then in what you're saying.
So touching wood, which won't get us out of trouble, but so far that appears to be the case. So the Argyll and Bute numbers, if you look at the graph, the published graph of Argyll and Bute, it's very, very clear that something happened, what we would call statistically a special cause. We know that that's a workplace outbreak, and it has come down again. So it would appear that as things stand today, that community transmission hasn't happened. And that's because of self-isolation, household isolation, and very strong support for that isolation. So if you can enable people to self-isolate, then that, of course, makes that easier. Now, that might be food parcels. It might just be phoning people up to ask them how they are. It might be peer group pressure to keep everybody isolated. And that appears to have worked very well in this environment, as it did, for example, in the Cooper Angus chicken processing plant outbreak. Very little community transmission from that, which was a fairly severe workplace outbreak.
So presumably,
perhaps I could just make a point myself. The outbreak at Faslane also illustrated some of the issues that arise in having a local authority context for this. Faslane is not in my constituency, but it is in the Garlandview local authority area. And it has led, of course, this week to us being able to some slight relaxation on certain island groups, which are very distant, although still in the local authority area, but also to, obviously, discussions, and very important discussions about what happens in very diverse local authority areas, very large local authority areas, and local authority areas that may have extreme rurality, but also have some, if not urban, then semi-urban areas. So there are big issues that are raised by this, and they are issues, as Jason Leach has indicated, which need to be discussed in the context of fine-tuning the system that we have.
Thank you, for coming in. I was going to ask that point, but thank you for you preempted my question on that. So I'm just thinking, Professor Leach, just drilling a little bit more down on this base one, is that presumably they therefore retain people. You said about the predominance of these cases in the 96, were they with the younger members of that site, i.e. non-marrieds?
No, I don't have that level of granularity. What I do have is confidence that the local incident management team would have that level of granularity and make judgments accordingly. So remember, if you have a positive case, your whole household isolates. So if you have school-age children and you have a positive case who happens to be one of the workers in that workplace, then those kids would be isolated with them. That appears to have worked because we haven't seen normal transmission from schools, from shops, from wherever else those individuals would go.
Well, thank you for that from our area. That's very good, and we're glad to see that positive outcome. Can I just have one final question to the Cabinet Secretary, and do jump in if you want to, Professor Leach, is what further consideration should be given to the issue of students having to pay for unoccupied accommodation over the winter break period, Cabinet Secretary?
We did, I think it's a very good question. We did tackle this in the one of the coronavirus pieces of legislation, or one of the two individual pieces of legislation. I know it has recurred as an issue. If it is not covered in those legislation, that legislation was designed to meet this situation. If it is not covered, then I think we've got two things we need to do. One is to raise the individual cases to individual members, because it would be quite wrong if there was a demand still being made for monies for people who aren't there. And the second one is to consider whether there is anything we can do in legislative terms, even in regulatory terms, as we've done, for example, in preventing evictions, to deal with that problem. So I've not seen myself evidence coming to me from individuals. Other members may have. They should be raising those with Richard Lochhead as the relevant minister, with Kevin Stewart, and I'm sure they will want to talk to me about whether we need to do something more in regulatory terms. We should certainly be doing our best to make sure that students are not disadvantaged at this time. It is hard enough what they're having to go through.
Is there a plan in your in your file, as it were, in case this comes up as a more prevalent issue?
The plan in my file is always, if there are that require urgently, then they'll get it. So, I do say to you, if that is coming up, and if people are raising it with the relevant minister, then members are raising it with the relevant minister, I'm more than willing to consider how we deal with it.
Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And Stuart McMillan is next.
Thank you, Convener. My first question is actually to Professor Leach, just that touches upon the questioning from Willie Coffey earlier on. When Willie Coffey raised the point about North Ayrshire, and also looking at the daily dashboard figures, clearly also North Ayrshire's figures have went up. Is there then a risk to Inverclyde, or severe Tier 2, North Ayrshire's Tier 3? If North Ayrshire were to change and potentially go up to Tier 4, could that have a knock-on effect to Inverclyde for us to potentially go up to Tier 3 to restrict the movement within the area also.
But it wouldn't be the principal reason, and Mr. Russell may want to comment on the balanced nature of the cabinet conversations. So at this committee previously, we've talked about how these decisions are made. So let me deal quickly with how the advice is given. So the advice is we start at local authority level, but that's not where we finish. We can't, because there isn't a barbed wire fence around the borders or around Dumfries and Galloway or around Inverclyde. So the reality is we start with the numbers inside that geographical unit. That's how we've decided to measure the prevalence of the virus. And then we work up from there. So the local public health lead says, this is the position in Inverclyde. Then we have to think about, where's the intensive care unit for Inverclyde? Well, that's partly in Inverclyde, but it's partly in Glasgow City. So what does that mean for us? And where do the people move to work? Where do people shop? Where do people go for hospitality? Where are the care homes that people visit from Inverclyde? So that takes us up a layer. It gets a little bit more inexact, of course. And that then takes us into those border conversations you've just described. So in South Lanarkshire, very rural, in the extreme South Lanarkshire, but very connected to Glasgow City and to other parts of the country. So we have to take that into account in our advice. And then at the Cabinet, there are then conversations about how those things are taken into account with travel regulations, with if somebody is surrounded by a group of threes, could you really make them a one? Can you do that? How will we advise those people to behave? So no, there wouldn't be a direct relationship between North Ayrshire's number and Inverclyde's number, but they are not, nor are they completely disconnected. There has to be a conversation about that somewhere in the process. It happens at the advice level, and then Mr. Russell might want to say something about how it happens at cabinet level.
There is always in Scotland a question about boundaries. I mean, many years ago, I was a member of the Arbuthnot Commission on Voting Systems and Boundaries, and boundaries in Scotland are about natural populations, and sometimes those boundaries cut across natural populations and where people actually live and how people move from one place to another. And there is, in this case, as Jason has indicated, the added complication of what you might call an island effect, not islands in terms of reducing regulations, but islands amongst areas of higher incidence and higher prevalence. And those are complex and difficult discussions to have. There is no, as Jason says, no automatic assumption that if this area is 3, that area must also be 3. But the question is, where does the population move to naturally? Where does the population look to? As an elected member, but if you look at local authority wards, sometimes those wards look extremely unwieldy, and they don't address where people actually move from one place to another. You bring people together who have no natural affinity, and therefore a knowledge, and there is that knowledge, of course, across the cabinet of areas of Scotland, how people move, how people might decide to move to shop, as Jason says, to travel, to go to work, to socialise, all those things come in. But there's no automatic assumption that that's going to happen. There's also a recognition of the boundary effect, that there will be a bleeding across boundaries simply because of where people live. Some local authority boundaries, run across communities. It's a very, very sensitive and complex area. It needs a lot of thinking. People might say, why have you used local authorities? Well, actually, you've got to use something, and local authorities are better in that regard than health board boundaries, because they're even less logical in that sense. But we do think about that a lot.
Okay, no, thank you for that.
I maybe should have started, Mr. McMillan, in a single sentence just to say that Inverclyde's numbers are encouraging and remain encouraging, but fragile, like the rest of the country. But Inverclyde at level 2 has managed to maintain a relatively slow but sustained reduction. It's stable. It's not plummeting, but nor is it rising. So the people of Inverclyde, whatever is going on with travel and everything else around them, it is going relatively well in Inverclyde compared to some other parts of the country.
No, thank you for that. The second question is regarding the vaccine. Now, also, the vaccine is not going to be mandatory for anyone, but my office has been contacted this week by a couple of individuals who've indicated that they're not prepared to take the vaccine, but these individuals work in the care home sector. And also, the care homes are at the highest level and the first groupings of individuals to get the vaccine. So clearly there'll be probably an HR issue would then result if staff are not prepared to take it, because potentially they are then putting the residents of the care homes at risk as well as others. Is there any advice, or is there anything that that yourself, Professor Leach, or Cabinet Secretary could say to encourage anyone who works within a care home, whether it's in Inverclyde or whether it's across Scotland, to take the vaccine?
Well, I mean, can I just start by saying I think we have to have an approach to this that is very inclusive, that is very open, and is based on evidence and information. So we should, as politicians and community leaders, we should show by example that we regard the vaccination program as extremely important, and that the risk in that is, the risk being talked about do not exist in the way that some people view them, and we should definitely try and persuade people to take the vaccine, and therefore I don't really think we're at the stage yet where we should be talking about HR issues. I think we should be talking about the way in which we reach out and say, by example, by persuasion, by information, this is desirable, safe, and important, and let's move in that direction. I'd be reluctant to enter into speculative discussion about HR and other such issues, because I hope that they will not become the issues of importance. The issues of importance about saving lives. The vaccine has been, and the vaccines are a remarkable testament to the hard work, ingenuity, inventiveness, and dedication of those who have worked on them. And nobody is being asked to do things that are dangerous. We're being asked to do things that, in the end, the outcome will be good. But Jason might want to say a word or two more. But I certainly think it is a matter of persuasion and discussion at the present moment. I don't think one should speculate on other matters.
I agree, Mr. Russell. I saw some data yesterday. I may have the numbers slightly wrong, forgive me, but the numbers suggested that 27 million people across the UK are not hesitant in any way. They will rush towards the vaccine when offered it. Another 27 million are hesitant, but not anti-vax. So they're not suggesting vaccines are a bad thing. They just want more information. They want to know that it's safe. They want to know that the regulator has done all the right things. They want to know from clinical advisors, maybe not, forgive me folks, not always from politicians, that it is safe to have this vaccine. We haven't started our mass campaign of information. We haven't started our TV adverts or door drop, because we don't think it's the right point at which to do that, because we're not at mass vaccination yet. But there will be a UK-wide campaign. There will then be a Scottish campaign. There will be a door drop into every house about vaccination. We will use clinical advisors and some famous faces to help with that. So I'm very hopeful that will get us through most of those people who are hesitant. To be completely honest, I'm not sure there's much I can do for the extreme edge who think we're microchipping the vaccine to follow people around the country. I'm not sure there's much I can do to communicate with that group. But the hesitant group, I think there are things we can do. We can explain the science, explain the regulation, explain the processes this has been through. And I'm very hopeful that that will be enough both for your constituents and everybody else, particularly those who could potentially put others at risk in care homes.
Yeah, no, thank you. And the final question, yes, it's regarding domestic abuse over the festive period, also particularly the 5-day, between 23rd and 27th. Also, the reports have indicated that there has been a 7% increase in domestic abuse incidents. So over the course of the last year, the 2 monthly reporting that the Scottish Government have undertaken, has that actually helped shape thinking, certainly for the festive period and potentially beyond, to try to provide potentially additional resource or assistance to help deal with domestic abuse incidents?
Yes, the figures are very distressing, but they're very important in terms of how we shape policy. And I indicated, I think, in response to questions on the report last week, that there have been a number of initiatives taken, and the police have taken a number of initiatives and will continue to do so. Regrettably, holiday periods are also additional difficult periods, and I'm sure the police are not only aware of that, but are taking forward their strategies to make sure that they do everything to help.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. I wonder if I could get some clarity on an issue that's emerged in the media today. Perhaps Professor Leach is best placed to answer. I'm wondering what the 6-week rule is in relation to the self-isolation rules. So the Scottish Government has confirmed in the Ferret today that there's been no change to the national guidance and there is no 6-week exemption. But NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has told councils that identified contacts of COVID-19 cases do not need to self-isolate if they themselves have been infected by COVID in the previous 6 weeks. It would be helpful to know why we have different advice in Greater Glasgow and Clyde from the rest of Scotland.
So I think the detail of it we'll take away and we'll respond to you in writing would seem to be the most sensible way to do it. I haven't seen the Ferret's article specifically. There is, I think it has arisen because there is a suggestion in some areas that, for example, if you're an intensive care doctor and you test positive and you do your self-isolation, there is no point in retesting that intensive care doctor for about 9 days because you can shed inactive, non-infectious genetic material of the virus. No risk to anybody, but you would still test positive and you would lose that intensive care doctor from work for a much, much longer period than known. And we've talked about the testing here many, many times. So remember, the test can't distinguish between live virus and remnants of virus. But we know if you've had a positive test and you self-isolate, particularly if you've had symptoms and you recover, you're not shedding the virus a month later. It's not biologically plausible. So there are some occasions where the 90-day thing is true. I'm just not quite sure if it's true on this occasion. It would appear to me that the guidance about the contact tracing and whether you should isolate or not hasn't changed. I'm certainly unaware of it having changed, and I think I would probably be in that loop. So let's come back to you on the specifics of it in writing, if that's okay with Mr. Russell.
Absolutely fine. I think that's the right thing to do.
Appreciate it. Okay, we've got time for a brief supplementary from Annabel Ewing.
Is that a meeting with elected reps and NHS 5 last Friday, I believe, and I'm getting a bit of traffic from the over 80s who are not in care homes, and I think I'm getting the message they need a bit of reassurance that they are absolutely on the list. I think there's just maybe a communication issue here. In one family, until I reassured them, they had spent about 24 hours being a bit worried and would they be left behind, and I think it was their grandmother or maybe an elderly aunt in her early 90s, and I was able to provide that reassurance on a one-to-one basis, but I just felt it was a shame that they'd had any worry, and I just wonder in terms of communication if there's something maybe that could be reflected upon further for this particular group of people who may not be using on a daily basis.
I did see material on this. I'll ask Jason to comment on this in a minute, but I did see material on this last week, I think, and the material was very clear and seems, I'd hope, been widely distributed. People are not to worry if they haven't been contacted as yet. This is the start of the programme. They will be contacted. Jason has made it very clear there's a very careful, rigorous programme underway. But I take the point that we don't want anybody to worry about this. So there's an assurance here that they will be contacted, and they have not been and will not be forgotten. And if we can reassure people further on that, then we should do so. Perhaps Jason would just like to confirm that nobody is going to be forgotten and everybody is going to be included. But we are at the start of a programme. I mean, it started well. I mean, look at the figures. Percentage of the population covered so far is higher than elsewhere. But it has a long way to go.
It's an excellent question. I should maybe say, first of all, that one of the people watching this will be my mother, probably, and she has a very special birthday today that puts her in this category. So I should wish her many happy returns. And she is also asking when will they come for her and will she not be forgotten. So I can both reassure her and your constituents, Ms. Ewing, that that we do know who all the over 80s are, and we will get to them just as soon as we have a vaccine that we can take to people, or a vaccine in a place where they can come. We, of course, won't be able to do everybody on the same day. There are, I think, this is maybe not right, I think 280,000 over 80s, maybe just over 300,000 over 80s. So that's more than we have vaccine. That's the simple equation. But we will get that level of vaccine, we're hoping, in January. So that will allow us to reach that group. That will be split into two groups, those who can travel to the vaccine, and then slightly more complicated, those we will have to take the vaccine to. That is a little bit more tricky, but we will get to them. And we will also, to reassure them further, that there will be mechanisms by which, if they feel they have been forgotten, because the system will not be foolproof, they will be able to reach out to us to say, have we fallen through the net? Is there a mistake? That's what we do with the flu vaccine, and that's what we will do with the COVID vaccine. So I'm not naive enough to think this will be a completely smooth process. Of course, there will be challenges with addresses or phone numbers or names, but we will get to them, and we know who they all are because everybody has a CAI number and everybody has a GP. So we can get to that register of people, including my mum and your constituents.
Thank you, and happy birthday to Professor Leach's mother. Enjoy your day.
I think that's the COVID Committee's first birthday shout out. So again, happy birthday. Very, very brief question and answer from Mark Ruskell.
I still have a lot of parents writing to me. They're feeling cautious. They don't want to send their children to school on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week. Are they right?
No. No, we have said repeatedly at this committee that we're doing everything we can to preserve normal schooling, and that's what we should continue to do. And I hope we're all as of one mind with that we are trying to preserve that normal schooling. The advice that John Swinney has operated on is public health advice, and has been very clear about that.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our evidence session under item 2. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and Professor Leach for their evidence. I now move to the third agenda item, which is consideration of the motions on the subordinate legislation that we have taken evidence on in the previous agenda item. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make any further remarks on these SSIs before we take the motion?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Are members content for motions S5M 23534, S5M 23603 and S5M 23683 to be moved en bloc? If any member is not content with this approach, please type N in the chat bar now. We have an indication from Mark Ruskell. Can I hold on a second? So we don't have agreement on that. Okay. Bear with me one second, sorry about this. Okay, just in the interest of time, obviously that we have a division. Mark, would you be able to indicate what your objection relates to, which item?
Yes, thanks, convener.
Thank you.
It's in relation to SSI 2020-415, which is the number 6 regulations.
The number 6 regulations. Thank you. Okay, apologies, just bear with me one moment. Okay. So the Cabinet Secretary, you don't wish to make any further remarks. Can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23534 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Levels Scotland Amendment Number 5 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-400 be approved.
Formally moved.
Does any member wish to speak to the motion? If so, please indicate by typing R in the chat. Annabel Ewing?
Sorry, I thought you were calling on us to vote. I might have been a wee bit hasty. Were we voting now or what?
It was just if you wanted to speak to the motion.
No, I don't. I'm terribly sorry. I was actually just voting, convener, so.
Okay. Okay, I will now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23534 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? If so, please type N in the chat bar now. Okay, members are agreed. Turn to the next motion in the agenda, which is motion to invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23603 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Levels Scotland Amendment Number 6 Regulations 2020 415 be approved. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Does any member wish to speak on this motion? Please indicate R in the chat. And invite Mark Ruskell to speak in the debate. Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. Thanks very much, convener. I find it very difficult to ignore the absolute chorus of concern that we've heard from the medical community over the last few weeks about these regulations and the potential for a surge of cases as a result of that. Now, I welcome the cautious overlay of additional guidance yesterday, more caution applied to these regulations from the Scottish Government. But I'm still very concerned that we've had a lack of clear modelling and a lack of clear evidence presented to this committee to back up this change in the regulations. And that leaves me in a very uncomfortable position. At the same time, I recognise that we sit here on the 17th of December and that time is running out now from now to Christmas. I think what I'd like to hear from the Scottish Government is that if cases go up in the days to come, that there will be a reconsideration of these regulations, even at the last minute, because I am concerned about the messages we're getting from the medical community about the potential for a surge of cases here. And as I said, that leaves me in a very uncomfortable position in voting to approve these regulations today.
Cabinet Secretary, invite you to respond.
I can understand the concern that Mr. Ruskell expresses. There are clearly concerns that exist, and he has heard from Professor Leach, for example, on the modelling issues, how difficult it is to model this. The four countries have worked very hard to try and come to an understanding on this, and I think we'd have been criticised if we had not done so, and we are being criticised for having done so. So I think that is an unfortunate set of circumstances we're in. Quite clearly, we would want to ensure that everybody is as safe as possible. And therefore, we have put in place for next week an additional review, which we had said might not take place, to look at the figures. Now, all I can say to Mr. Ruskell is that we will and do continue to look at the figures on a daily basis, that the Cabinet will have the opportunity to review these figures again on Tuesday, The Cabinet, of course, can be called into session at any time, but we have to balance that against the certainty that to take advantage of the Christmas relaxation in the most limited way possible. And I'd stress that yet again, and the guidance is stronger and stronger on that. Now, therefore, I do think I can understand the reservation, but I do think that we have to accept that we are presently in the situation where that Christmas relaxation will take place. We're asking people to be very restrained and careful about it, and we will continue to look at the figures. Of course, we will continue to look at the figures, but I don't want to create panic or uncertainty or fear in people's minds, so we will do this in a responsible and careful way and alongside the other administrations.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I will now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23603 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? If so, please type N in the chat bar now. Okay, members are not agreed, so there will be a division. And I can advise members that the clerks will type the motion number into the chat bar for clarity. Can I invite members who agree with the motion to type Y into the chat bar, please? And those who don't agree to type N, please. And any member wishing to abstain should type A. We'll just check the result. Just bear with us one moment. Okay, so on motion S5M 23603, for the motion, Maurice Corrie, Annabel Ewing, Monica Lennon, John Mason, Stuart McMillan, Beatrice Wishart, and against. There was no votes against, there was one abstention, Mark Russell. Therefore, the motion is agreed to. I can now turn to the final motion on our agenda and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23683 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment No. 7 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-427 be approved.
Moved.
Does any member wish to speak? No indications on that. I will now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23683 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? If so, please type N in the chat bar. No indication. Therefore, the motion is agreed to. And that concludes that part of the business. The committee will publish a report to the Parliament setting out our decisions on the statutory instruments considered at the meeting in the coming days. That concludes our consideration of this agenda item and our time with the Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to thank both the Cabinet Secretary and the National Clinical Director for their attendance and time this morning, and to all the members. We've had quite a lot to get through, so thank you for your patience. I now close the meeting.